A biblical perspective on life, culture and current events. This is 2020 on Vision.
We're back with Christian commentator, pastor and consultant Stephen McAlpine, and today we're talking about cultural battles that are polarising Western nations and overflowing onto streets with violence. We're going to talk about what's going on in the UK and whether there is wisdom from God for any sort of solutions before it really hits our shores here in Australia. That conversation is coming just ahead. Then we're 90 minutes away from a very interesting dimension being brought to light by a pastor concerned about our ownership of land and houses. We're going to hear from former Senator Len Harris, who is also an ordained Christian minister. He's travelling Australia right now and he's warning that Australians have no proof of home ownership. Well, he thinks that's a serious issue. Hear that conversation 90 minutes from now. Then on Faith and the Future with Dr. Camille Majdali, our series is on Europe, and today we're unpacking a thought or two on Britain's identity and achievements. Engaging conversations ahead on this Tuesday edition of 2020. You might have noticed that much of the world is experiencing some level of chaos. Of course, there are nations at war like Russia and Ukraine, or threatening war like the possibilities of an escalation in the Middle East. And then there are lots of nations where cultural battles are simmering and ideological tensions are overflowing to violence on the streets. And perhaps the riots in cities around the UK may be an illustration of just how social order is breaking down in so many places. People are quick to take sides on divisive ideological issues, and extremists love to fuel the fire. Well, Stephen McAlpine is back with us. He's an award-winning Christian author, pastor and national consultant for churches and Christian schools. Stephen McAlpine, a special welcome back to 2020.
Good to be with you again, Neil, even in the midst of all the chaos.
In the midst of the chaos. Well, maybe it's not so chaotic right where we are, but I guess we're looking at the rest of the world right now saying, hey, this is looking pretty dangerous in some places. An increasing polarisation, people taking sides around the world. Give us your insight here into what you've been observing about the UK and riots on the streets there.
Yeah, very interesting. Like Greg Sheridan, writing in The Australian, said there's a long tradition of street violence in Britain on the left, the right, and over lots of issues. But some of these tensions, I think, at the moment, they come to the fore because, as Greg Sheridan rightly says, there's a mistrust of authority and institutions. And I think that's probably part of what's going on, and that's underneath the surface. On the surface, there's just thuggery that wants to look for something to fight about. And I think there's a pressure valve in our cultural times at the moment where people hard on the left and hard on the right are pushing back against what they see as injustices in their areas of life, and that's coming to the tension. UK, US, and hopefully not here, but you see it in sort of shadow form in Australia, but at a much more dialed down level, I think. But the British one, I think that's been a tinderbox waiting to blow up for a while, I think.
And sometimes people will say maybe it's the straw that breaks the camel's back and there's deeper issues at play. But, of course, Britain's been hit with these riots on their streets. They erupted after those 3 young girls were killed in a knife attack in Southport in northwest England. And, of course, the trigger was some misinformation. And interesting, when you identify this mistrust of authority, sometimes, and we've got to say this is the case in Australia too, that police and those who are in authority are slow to get out the facts, and social media now takes over, and the facts get, whether they're true or misinformation, they spread very rapidly.
Yeah, well, that's always the way, isn't it? That I think in one sense, in our culture, there are huge swathes of people who no longer trust the institutions. And they say, well, the police were slow to deal with past riots on issues we didn't agree with, but they're very quick to push hard on issues we do agree with. And then in the middle, you'll get social media issues. And so part of the issue is, how do you have a conversation about hard topics like immigration in the UK? That's been hard over the last 20 years. And so then it blows up. And then you do get, you know, this person who did the murders was a Muslim, not true. and then boom. And it's very hard to shut those things down. And obviously the government in the UK is trying to do that. But in one sense, there's plenty of reasons for the way people respond angrily to situations, but no excuse in that sense. What we've seen has been pretty brutal and horrible, and it won't bode well for good community relationships in the future. And I think you're seeing that across a lot of issues in the West at the moment. Our own Prime Minister said, it was interesting this morning because the religious discrimination bill has been a huge issue, religious freedom bill, anti-discrimination legislation, for a while. And Anthony Albanese is looking at that, and he said today, the last thing Australia needs is any, hard fighting relating to religion and people's faith, or a divisive debate, as he called it. And so he doesn't want that to happen, and we're sort of in Australia going, we're having a Cold War about these things, but we don't want it to become much more escalated. And I think the Prime Minister is right on that, but I don't think that's going to solve the issue in the long term.
And the thought of shutting down any debate around religion to try and keep it all neatly secular, that might be a dream that just can never actually come true. Come back to this sense that the ruling classes have come adrift from people, because even hearing statements like that from the Prime Minister, and, there's a sort of sense in which you might be hearing him call for calm, but there's a lot of things that are going on, policies on both sides of government that might actually get under the skin of people from religious perspectives. And we talk about those sorts of things a lot on this program, where things go anti-Christian, and there's a need for some level of, having your voice heard. But this thought that the ruling classes come adrift from the people, that's happening more and more in Western nations.
Well, I think in one sense, while people are having debates about other things at the top level, the average punter is going, I can't afford my house, food prices have gone up, and no one seems interested in that. So I think that's part of the resentment. So you see very quickly in the Western nations at the moment that someone is voted in from one party and promises that we're going to bring everything together, and within a month everything is broken again. Because I think the divide is definitely between those who are, in America you'd say inside the Beltway, or, in the centres of power, and those external to that. And the further you go away, you look at the cities in the UK where the riots were, we're talking 23% unemployment in some of those places. So that, once again, not an excuse, but you can see some of the things piling up that cause people to become resentful if they're not being heard. And as Greg Sheridan says in the paper today, once there's a loss of trust in the authority of the institutions, then you've got problems. And I think that's part of our issue. The other issue too is I think there's an academic cultural push for theories that say the world is divided between two groups of people, the power, the disempowered, the victim, the oppressor, and there is no grey spot in the middle, and that's just not true.
Yes, and the symptom, you might say, could be the formation of gangs on the streets. And we might all throw our hands up and say, well, we wouldn't be part of a gang, but gangs on the streets often reflecting the sentiment of the people, and might be representing one side or another.
Yeah, well, I think one of the things we've got to realise too is that rioting in the streets, England is throwing its hands up in horror at the way things are going, but they did kill their king once. It's not like they haven't gone to civil war and stuff. And that probably tells us that as moderns, as people who are modern, we think we're beyond that, and we never are. It's always in the surface, under the surface, and it's also in us. But we know what social media is like with us. We want to push back hard, and we want to nail our colours to the mast, and it becomes very divisive very quickly. And I think the conditions are ripe for those things in the Western setting at the moment. We don't have a common understanding of what it means to be human, or a common understanding of human flourishing in the West any longer. And so we're very divided. You see it in the UK and the US at the moment, and to a lesser extent here in Australia.
And no doubt a need for us as Christians and part of churches and part of Christian media to be able to paint the picture and show people what human flourishing looks like under God. That's going to be, in some ways, a way that we can navigate a way forward. What are your thoughts on the role that Christians and churches have when it comes to this human flourishing?
Well, I think there's two aspects of it. I think that Christianity has a place in the public square. One of the comments made about the Paris Olympic ceremony, which, we're beaten to death, I suppose, is that it was a post-Christian expression of virtue. And so in our world at the moment, when the Christian framework is pushed off the map, you don't get some sort of virtuous sort of freedom. You get very tight power plays. And I think Christians in the public square have to show that we do things differently and showcase something that's more compelling, which is why I want to see good Christian politicians, lawyers, media people in that space. But as far as the church is concerned, I think Ephesians 2 is a very interesting example where Paul is writing to the Ephesian church and saying that they're an example of a temple that is being built up in unity in Christ. And he says that in the context of Ephesus, where the temple of Diana of the Ephesians is one of the major attractions of the world. And there was a sense that unity was going to be brought around this sort of temple. And Paul says, actually, here's a different temple where love is at the center and Jesus is the cornerstone. So the church is, in a sense, a witness to the world of what unity can look like. And that's something we have to lean into harder and harder at the moment, and as the rest of the culture fractures.
And, as we're observing the polarisation and people taking sides, I can't help but think that there are extremists who love to fuel the fires of conflict or this battle of ideas, and maybe they're furthering their own political ambitions. But where do you think the church and Christians fit into that too? Because this battle of ideas these days happens online before it overflows onto the streets. Do Christians need to be more loud and proud and engaging in that battle of ideas? Because it seems to happen in social media.
Maybe loud and humble, given that pride is such a thing. And that's part of the issue, is that it's not someone else's pride that's my problem, it's my pride. And so it starts with me. And that's G.K. Chesterton's line when someone wrote, and say, look, before the First World War, in the Times, the famous quip was a competition where the Times asked the question, what is wrong with the world? And G.K. Chesterton wrote a short letter back to the editor saying, dear sir, I am yours truly, G.K. Chesterton. So he was able to pinpoint the issue with himself. Part of our issue at the moment is that everyone else is the problem in everyone else's eyes. It's not an introspective culture, other than if I look into my heart, I should be true to my heart. And the Bible says not that. It says the opposite of that your heart is not something you should trust. It's deceitful. It deceives you.
So, Stephen, when we look at the UK and the riots on the streets there, thinking of many decades, perhaps of a simmering along set of issues around immigration, and people who know UK politics, UK history might be able to identify things there that might be in the history, and this brought to a head by these stabbings in that attack. But what about Australia? What sort of vulnerabilities do you think we face? Are we in the same sort of boat? Those sorts of tensions, are they likely to come to the fore anytime soon here?
Well, I think they break out in different ways, and I think the same issues happen there as here. Though, if you've ever lived in the UK, you realise it's a much more polarised society in terms of ethnic people from ethnic areas don't integrate as well as I think that they possibly do in Australia. But it was interesting that Greg Sheridan also said that in a previous protests, such as the Black Lives Matter, they were seen as expressions, he says, of virtuous identity politics. And the perception, whether it was a reality or perception, perhaps a bit of both, is that they got softer treatment from the institutions. So people are going, well, we're polarising where the state takes one position and treats it softly, and takes our position and treats us hardly, or treats us, in a much harder way. And I think unless you can break that thought, and unless you can show that you're being even-handed as an institution, this is going to keep happening. I don't think Australia's anywhere near that, though it tries. In one sense, I think there's an academic focus on how divided we are, but I don't think the average Australian feels that, and I don't think that the average Australian is hostile towards other people coming into our country. We've done a great job of being an ethnically diverse culture in Australia in a way that I think is different to the UK, because it seems much more divided.
We voted no in the referendum recently, and that had some of the elements that you're talking about, the perception that there would be possibly a two-tiered system in Australia. Those sorts of things, I think perhaps the majority of Australians there perhaps spoke loud and clear that we want one law, we want to be gathered together as one people. Is that one of the foundations, do you think, of having, a resistance to some of the challenges that they might be facing in other nations?
Well, a good thing for being Australia is everything arrives at you late, so you get to see what the results of the decisions are beforehand. So maybe that's true. And I think in one sense that's Anthony Albanese's comment today. We don't need another divisive debate because he probably feels he got his nose a bit bloodied from last year's divisive debate. And he's going, no, let's dial this one down. And so it's possible to step back from the brink, and it's going to need good leadership from both the ruling party and the opposition to be able to do that. But it's not just about the institutions, it's about people ourselves. And the church has got a place to play in that, to navigate that well, and also to show to people who are perhaps the average person in the streets going, what is going on? What does forgiveness even look like in our culture anymore? And I think the church has got a great opportunity to show that.
Stephen, where do we go for some insight from the foundation for where Christians discover and stand on truth, a truth that's going to hold us through hard times? Is there particular scripture that you've been focusing on as to how we might strengthen ourselves and resist the sort of polarisation that might be happening in other nations? Where do you start?
Well, I think I'd start with, if you look at Ephesians, and especially in chapter 2, you get as the church is being built up, you see there's hostility. The whole point of Ephesians 2 is there's been a hostility vertically between humans and God, and that has led to a hostility or division between humans and humans horizontally. And part of the letter that Paul's writing is saying you can't get rid of the horizontal hostility until you address the vertical hostility. And my mum, being from Northern Ireland, used to attend a Bible study with people who'd been on both sides of that dividing wall in Northern Ireland, which is huge. And there they are in the room praying together, reading the Bible together, including one man who'd blown his hands off, making a bomb to kill a policeman. And suddenly the gospel changed him to the point that his hatred was shifted to love. And that's because the hostility wall between him and God was broken, and therefore the hostility wall between, Protestants and Catholics at the time and the whole debate of Republican and loyalist was broken down because it wasn't central to what it means to be living under God.
An illustration of the transformation that can happen in a human life when that hostility between God and man is overcome and reconciliation happens. And I guess if we're going to avoid the sort of polarisation that we're talking about in other nations and actually heal any rifts that maybe are there now, we need to be very conscious of this reconciliation to God, because then if we have a common purpose under Him, we can be reconciled together. Is that a simpler way of looking at it?
Yeah, and look, it starts with me, right? It means something I've said on social media. If someone is say that was really badly put, I have to be able to apologise, and I'll only be able to say, sorry, please forgive me, to the extent that I understand that I've been forgiven. And that's Jesus talking about the unforgiving servant who didn't realise his own forgiveness from the king who'd forgiven him a great debt, and he couldn't forgive a small debt. And that's probably where it starts. It has to start there.
And I guess, you can be idealistic, but the need for national revival, sometimes that's just been something we say because it sounds nice. But really, that's a necessity, isn't it, if you're going to have a harmonious, flourishing nation?
Yeah, look, I don't think the goal of human flourishing is human flourishing. I think the goal of human flourishing is the glory of God, and you would want to pray that people become Christian because we believe that that is the true place of reconciliation. Look, I don't think we should be, I don't think we should be pessimistic about that either, because I do see a slow tide turning towards people who are younger, especially going, is there something more than this division? and people are becoming Christian. Now, that may be a trickle, that may be a flood, but tides do come back in, and I think we can pray to that end and model it as we go.
Well, Stephen McAlpine, lots of great words of wisdom as always. Stephen McAlpine, an award-winning Christian author, pastor, national consultant for churches and Christian schools. You can connect with Stephen at stephenmcalpine.com. stephenmcalpine.com. Stephen, thanks so much for joining us once again today on 2020.
Great to be with you, Neil.
Thanks for taking time to listen to this audio on demand from Vision Christian Media. To find out more about us, go to vision.org.au.